Good morning. I'm sitting with David Gottlieb, Dr. David Gottlieb, and David is an alum and a graduate of the University of Chicago Divinity School, like myself, and we share a few teachers. We were blessed to have great mentors and professors. The last of a great tradition in a way, because they're now retired mostly. David is the current director of Jewish Studies at the Spurtus Institute in Chicago. So I'll start by asking him to talk a bit about his own personal, spiritual, and intellectual journey, about the books, about the people who have made a difference, who have influenced him and got him where he is today. Please, David.
Thank you, Adrian. Lovely to be speaking with you. So my journey, my spiritual journey is a long one, and I've documented some of it in very different types of writing, some very personal, some more spiritual, and some involved in a project that I didn't really realize what I was a part of until it was over, which was an endeavor on the part of an Orthodox rabbi to draw me back from Eastern contemplative practice into traditional Jewish practice. But I'll talk more about that in a minute. So I'm the youngest of 6 children, raised on the south side of Chicago in Hyde Park. My parents were not affiliated with the University of Chicago, but they thought that they deeply valued they deeply believed in Western liberal values, and they wanted to raise us in an urban and integrated neighborhood. And they thought Hyde Park would be the best place to do that. So I was raised in Hyde Park when I was just before my 12th birthday. My 4 older sisters had already grown up and left the house. My brother and I were still at home. And my parents, in a sort of what later came to be known as a midlife crisis, decided that we were too comfortable in our lives and we needed to experience something radically different. And they took my brother and me. They sold the house that we had grown up in. They removed the middle seat of our Volkswagen bus, packed it with mostly suitcases, but also a duffel bag full of books, because at this time my mother was studying for her comprehensive exams, because late in life she got a PhD in English literature at the University of Chicago also. So this was in the early 1970s. We packed up the VW bus and we drove to Mexico. We lived in Mexico for a year. And this was, in some ways, a delightful and in some ways a traumatic experience that opened my eyes to the experience of being an other. I would say that growing up in Hyde Park was, for me anyway, a very comfortable experience. I took for granted being around a variety of different people, having friends of different races and genders, interacting with different types of people every day, seeing Muhammad Ali on the street corner, because I grew up around the corner from where he lived. So it was a combination of the ordinary and the extraordinary, people who were like me and people who weren't like me. But when we lived in Mexico, we were radically alien. We lived in a town about an hour and a half from Mexico City, Cuernavaca, and I went to a school, a multilingual school. I had to learn Spanish. I had to play on the playground with kids that for the first 3 weeks couldn't understand a word they said. And for me, this was a really eye-opening and transformative experience. It wasn't a spiritual experience, but it changed something fundamentally about my orientation toward the world. In terms of Jewish awareness, growing up, we had almost none. We were raised more or less culturally Jewish. We went to synagogue a couple of times a year. My parents sent us to Sunday school at KAM Isaiah Israel, a Reformed synagogue in Hyde Park. But my brother and I announced in classic 60s protesting fashion, when he was in 6th grade and I was in 4th, that we weren't going to go anymore. And that our parents could drop us off there, they could march us in that direction, but we couldn't guarantee that we'd wind up there. And our parents realized that they were failing on some fundamental level to give us an awareness of our Jewish background. They had no idea what to do because, for one reason and another, from their different backgrounds, they had very little Jewish awareness or upbringing themselves. I'll go into that just briefly. My mother's father came to the United States at the age of 10 from what is now Ukraine, spoke no English, wound up graduating from law school and having a successful career as a lawyer. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was born to poor Jews on the west side of Chicago. Her life was changed when she went to Jane Addams' Hull House and learned what it meant to be a citizen of the world. My father came from German and Bohemian Jews who were cultured and assimilated before they ever got here. My great-grandfather, Abraham Gottlieb, was the chief engineer of the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. He came to the United States in 1857 as a trained engineer, which at that time was very, very unusual. And he worked with and then was fired by Daniel Burnham, the visionary architect and urban planner, but went on to have a successful career nonetheless as an engineer. So my father and even his father were born into a very assimilated German Jewish culture. And by the time they got to us, there was very little in the way of Jewish education or awareness. Okay, so that's kind of the background. Now, flash forward to my early 30s. I'm divorced. I'm penniless. I have no idea what I'm doing. My brother lives in Denver. This is the early 90s, and he said, you should come out here. There's mountains. It's the land of opportunity. You'd love it out here. I even have a woman I'd like to introduce you to. And that woman I wound up marrying, and she is next year we'll celebrate our 30th anniversary. She really began my spiritual journey. She's a very observant Jewish woman, raised in the conservative movement. She had 2 young daughters from a previous marriage. And when we began dating seriously, and I was already in love with her and the girls, she said to me, look, you're wonderful with the girls and with me. I love you and I know you love me, but you don't know anything about Judaism. And to me, Judaism is so fundamental to my identity and to how I'm raising the girls that it won't work unless you start getting educated. That began a process of Jewish education. I did an adult confirmation at the synagogue where she was a cantor in Denver. And I just kept learning until we moved back to Chicago in the late 90s. By then we had a son together. And in 2008, after a long spiritual journey, which I can talk about in a minute because I've been going on for a while already, I decided I wanted to really steep myself in Jewish learning. And somehow, I still don't know how, I got into the divinity school at the University of Chicago in 2008, into the master's program, and graduated from that in 2010 and got into the PhD program in the history of Judaism, where we had the great mentors that you speak about. So my spiritual journey culminated in a kind of intellectual journey that reached its peak really when I got my PhD in 2018 from the divinity school. In the midst of that, there was a spiritual crisis where we had moved back to Chicago. I had joined her brothers in a family real estate business. We joined a very traditional conservative shul, and all of a sudden I didn't understand my own life. And at this traditional conservative shul where everything is in Hebrew, everything, except the sermon and the prayer for our country, I didn't understand what was going on. And I felt spiritually alienated. So I did a deep dive into learning contemplative practice at a Zen center in Evanston, Illinois. I deeply studied Zen Buddhism for a while. I became lay ordained as a Zen Buddhist, which was the most difficult time in my marriage because to my wife, that was like having an affair. But as a result of that experience, I began to deeply experience myself as a Jewish person. And it was as a result of that, what I will call detour, that I decided I needed to deeply explore my own Judaism. And for me personally, that took an intellectual avenue primarily. We're observant Jews, we keep a kosher home. My principal avenue of exploration in Jewish experience is intellectual, not spiritual. I do practice and teach Jewish mindfulness practice because I think Jewish wisdom is rife with understanding of how to be present in a world where, as Michael Fishbane, one of our mentors, says, the elemental and the everyday cross all the time, and we live at the intersection of the miraculous and the quotidian. To me, mindfulness practice is an avenue to understanding and deeply experiencing that. And I just want to experience it in a Jewish context because I now, as a result of Buddhism, ironically, deeply understand myself as a Jew. That's, in the quickest nutshell I can provide, which I know wasn't that quick, the story of my spiritual journey, which really culminated in the intellectual experience of deep study.
Wow, thank you. Very rich. I don't even know which thread to pick. I'm gonna pick the last point you made because I think that's a matter of nuance. You said that you practice Judaism at an intellectual level, if I understood you correct.
I would say my primary experience of Judaism is through study.
And then after you did the detour to Zen Buddhism, you were able to come back and appreciate the spiritual side you mentioned, but right?
Yes.
More in a more day-to-day mindfulness oriented practice, right?
Correct. Although this is, many people say about Buddhism, especially Mahayana Buddhism and Zen Buddhism, of which Zen is a major branch of Mahayana Buddhism, that it's a Buddhism without beliefs. While that's not exactly true, it is true that Zen Buddhism, as I experienced it and as it is generally taught in the West, is shorn of many of its theological roots. And Zen teachers in the West make a big point of saying, we're not telling you anything you have to believe. And for me, that opened a huge, rich vein of understanding Judaism as also saying, we're not asking you to take anything on faith. We are, and I know that in your discussion with Mona Fishbane, she talked about orthopraxy, right? The tradition of practice, as distinguished from orthodoxy, the tradition and structure of belief. To me, the rich vein of Judaism that Zen Buddhism opened for me was living under a rubric of law and faithfulness, not faith, but faithfulness, that opens one to the understanding that the crossing point of the everyday and the divine or the miraculous is to be most deeply experienced through a rubric of discipline and law and faithful practice. So that was what the practice of meditation helped open for me in terms of understanding my own and practicing my own Jewishness.
Thank you. And I completely agree that the way Zen Buddhism and Buddhism is presented in the West as radically anti-ritualistic is a little bit very one-sided, right? There is the famous story about I think it's a Zen story about the young disciples who want to attain enlightenment real quick, and the master tells them, go wash your dishes, right? Right. So, and the other point is about the issue of faith, right? I think both in Christianity and in Judaism, I think we have been left with a very problematic, narrow understanding of faith, right? As this irrational, close your eyes, anti-rational, anti-practice, thing. Which, and unfortunately, it is a prejudice against what faith is.
Agreed. Which is ironic because both, in Christianity, all the traditions, but I would particularly, for the purposes of our conversation, point out Orthodox Christianity and Catholicism have rich intellectual, theological traditions that draw heavily on ancient philosophical traditions to enlighten one to how the intellect and the mind play roles in fashioning a life of faith or faithfulness. in Judaism, in Hebrew, the word emunah, which is often translated as faith, really means faithfulness. Faithfulness to a discipline, as I said, to structures of law, but also to an understanding that even when the going gets rough, the going is the going. The going is how you go. And there's a great deal of virtue in that. And I think in some ways, Western traditions of the hegemony of the individual resent that and suspect that.
And you're drawing on this on Emunah, which Professor Fishbane has done, in a wonderful way, expanded and the meaning of it, showing the various connotations that you already mentioned: faithfulness, witnessing,
Yes.
A certain type of being there, attentiveness to what is going on around you socially, and
exactly, right,
and,
a deep attentiveness to what's before you, but doing it under a structure that's provided for you, not how you want to do it necessarily, or how you feel like doing it that day, or not doing it because you don't feel like it. Those are parts of the slippery slope that Judaism worries about, and that it runs deep into in the rabbinic era with Hellenistic thought, where for example, the Stoics are about mastering the self, and the self is put at the center of experience. Judaism has a lot of sympathy for that, but also deeply roots the self in the context of a community. That is a difference that I think is crucial, and which was very eye-opening for me as somebody who came late to an understanding and practice of Judaism.
Yeah, I mean, you see this type of attention to the self and cultivation of the self connected to a larger framework. You see it in Confucius too, or I mean, I always use this saying by Confucius, who says, "Well, when I was 17, I started, I started studying the commandments. Then at 30, I stopped being confused, and at 70, I listened to my own heart." It's like, wow, that the reverse of an American education, where you're told, well, listen to yourself when you're very confused at 18, right?
That's right. Follow your heart.
And it got to the point where it's very hard to even get students to understand that they should not completely mistrust or be suspicious towards anything that comes from outside. They especially millennials have this deep suspicion for anything that comes from outside.
That's right. And I think that also has its roots not only in the Western philosophical tradition, especially with people like Spinoza, but also comes from the way the 1960s broke apart this unquestioning adherence to traditional structures, and the way I would even say that the Watergate era demolished faith in political traditions, structures, and powerful individuals. At that point, from my admittedly more narrow perspective now, historically speaking, although some millennials may not be aware of this, their suspicion of anything that comes from outside has legitimate roots in the way institutions betrayed people, and the way in the 60s and 70s, the generation that was coming up said, we are no longer going to unquestioningly listen to authority figures, because they really have their own interests primarily at heart and not ours. They're sending us to die for a war that makes no sense. Therefore, they by definition don't have our interests at heart, and everything that has happened since then has played for subsequent generations, I believe, has played into that narrative.
So how do you think, as educators, we can re-enchant, or what can we do, right, to help young people, and also a lot of the boomer generation, which has become very distant and disenchanted with religion, and with religion, I should say, with religious traditions and religious practices. How can that interest or be rekindled?
That's a great question. And I will just tell you sort of one approach that I take to it. So my dissertation was on the formative influence played by the Binding of Isaac story, the Akedah in the book of Genesis, the formative influence that story has had on the formation of Jewish memory. For me, that story contains the germ of human interpretive autonomy wrested from God. Not even wrested, but freely given by God. In other words, in the Binding of Isaac story, Abraham perceives a command from God to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac. And at the moment when he stretches forth his hand to slay his son, the angel of God stops his hand, and he raises his eyes and sees a ram trapped in a thicket behind him. And there is no command given for Abraham to substitute the ram for his son. He freely makes that interpretation. After he sacrifices the ram, the angel of God appears a second time and says, because thou hast done this thing, and the Torah doesn't say what this thing is exactly, because thou hast done this thing, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sands in the seashore. You'll seize the gates of your foes. And so the rabbis ask, well, what is the thing? Which thing is the thing that he did that caused God to say this? Adrian, in my humble view, I don't mean to put myself beside the great sages of our tradition, but in my view, the thing that Abraham did was to substitute the ram. He understood that there was a hermeneutical opportunity there to sacrifice something to God that preserved and sanctified the relationship without destroying the promise that God had already made to him, that his son would be the progenitor of a great many descendants. So the reason I bring all this up is because when I talk about the Binding of Isaac story to people, they go, oh, that story's disgusting. Why is that even in our tradition? And why on the high holidays do we have to read again? And, when people happen to go to the daily prayer service in the morning, the story of the Binding of Isaac is read every single day in Jewish prayer. And on the high holidays and Rosh Hashanah, on the second day of Rosh Hashanah outside the land of Israel, it's read. Why is this story everywhere? To modern sensibilities, the story is disgusting. You're going to valorize a man who was ready to slaughter his own son because he had some fever dream about being told to do it? How is that? How can you claim that ours is a moral tradition if that's one of its foundational stories? And to me, that sensibility misses much that is rich about the tradition. So to go back to your original question, how do we help baby boomers and subsequent generations shed their suspicion of these stories? To me, there are subterranean levels to these stories that we are not taught because our sensibilities about individual autonomy are so violated by these stories. But if you dig under the sense of violation, you find profound meaning and wisdom. Not only, let's go back to the example of the Akedah for a moment. Most of the interpretations that we see about the Binding of Isaac story is about Abraham. Well, Abraham heard this command. And the rabbis say that Abraham delayed a journey to Mount Moriah that should take 8 hours, took him 3 days. He was stalling for time. He was looking for any way he could to get out of it. He was obeying and resisting at the same time. But to me, the real richness of the story, and this is where I see value for current generations, is in the story of Isaac, who is a sufferer of trauma that most of us cannot even imagine, and who goes on to build a life as a phenomenally successful agriculturalist, as a peacemaker, and as the first person in the Bible who falls in love. His love for Rebecca is the first mention of love between a man and a woman, between two human beings in the Hebrew Bible. So the story is not only, and to me, not even primarily about Abraham. It's about Isaac's ability to recover from trauma. But in the case of Abraham, it's also about Abraham's way to interpret his way out of mortal and moral danger. And that is the beauty of Judaism. And that is the beauty inherent in the story, that if you just look at it on its surface level, you go, I don't even want to talk about this story. And I know many people who went to Jewish day school and remember hearing this story as children, and kids in the class bursting into tears. And why wouldn't a kid burst into tears at the sound of this story? It's a horrifying story for a child to hear, that your parent might murder you because God told them to. Well, to me, first of all, Adrian, that story should not be taught to children. But second of all, that story has deep richness and meaning about our interpretive autonomy within the context of our spiritual traditions. And I think this is something that most people, especially in the West, don't understand today, is that even in the most orthodox traditions, there is radical interpretive creativity. And it's that we need to explore, and that we need to teach.
Thank you. Wow, wonderful. I'm so glad you delved into your dissertation as well. I mean, what a wonderful message and insight from there. Wonderful. And along those lines, it's I think there's several factors. One, the way religious education is done, and I see that in the Christian context, a type of top-down, not dialogical, right? Not dialogical, not Buberian at all, right? It's basically suck it up, shut up, and go home. And if you like it, take it or leave it, basically.
And you better take it.
Yeah. And then also there is a lack of, or a superficial understanding on the side of people of their own traditions, right? Where they don't have the time, the patience to explore the various levels, right? Hermeneutical, practical practices of their own traditions, right?
This is a super important point. This is a super important point that you're making. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm so enthused by what you're saying that I want to respond to it before I forget what I'm going to say, which happens more and more these days. And that is that we are, part of the reason I'm so interested in the concept of memory is that we're buried in data now, and our memories are being suffocated. When I talk about memory, cultural memory or Jewish memory, I'm not talking, as we tend to talk in the West, about data storage and retrieval, which is the most literal form of memory, and the kind that we tend to not only talk about, but that we're beginning to mimic. We are beginning to mimic our machines in how we remember. I can retrieve anything, so I don't have to remember anything. But memory means an embodied and experiential taking in of something. And the way that we experience our traditions has gotten shallower and shallower, partly because we are buried by more and more data and less actual memory. In German, there are different words for memory. One is Speicher, which is like storage, is like data storage. But a more experiential one would be Erinnerung, which is the lived experience and the ability to recall almost the sense memory of something having happened. We have too much Speicher and not enough Erinnerung in our daily life.
Yeah, and there is also Gedächtnis, which is very
correct,
based on more psychological. But
that's the third one. Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So we only have the one word, and the same word that we use for our faculty, we use for our computers.
Yeah.
So we are beginning to, profoundly confuse, become amnesiacs, and we're forgetting what memory is.
Yeah, and then you see that when you teach, right? I mean, it's as simple as
it's hard. It's hard for people to retrieve facts or experience knowledge because they can gain it with the click of a button.
Yeah, and then you probably had the people in your family, your parents, your grandparents, who memorized and knew so many things, right? I mean, that's incredible how the paradigm has shifted.
You remind me of a story that my mother told. My four older sisters were confirmed at KAM Isaiah Israel. They went through confirmation. And my mother's parents came to the confirmation of all my sisters, and she remembers at one of the older sisters' confirmations, and remember, my mother grew up with nothing, absolutely nothing. My mother remembers sitting next to her father at the confirmation, and the rabbi says to open the prayer book, and it has English on one side and Hebrew on the other. And the rabbi starts saying the Hebrew, and my grandfather says it right along with the rabbi. In fact, isn't even looking at the book. And my mother says to her father, Dad, I didn't even know that you know this. How do you know this? And he said, it was beaten into me at Cheder. In other words, at the elementary yeshivish school that he went to, you memorized this stuff, and if you couldn't memorize, you got hit. So it was embodied in the harshest possible way. Adrian, I'm not suggesting that you beat your students.
I partook. I had probably not a similar education in Eastern Europe, right? We were good at music but let me ask you something about the transition from, let's say, your grandparents, your mother's grandparents, as parents, your grandparents, and her generation. Then, why did they not pass along this traditio, right? Passing it along, because it seems they were steeped in it themselves. They embodied it, and then they did not deem it. I don't understand what happened. Why that break happened?
There is. In the experience of Jewish immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe, the experience of being harshly othered and having that as an essential basis of one's experience. When our ancestors came to this country, to varying degrees, they were beginning to experience the merest hint of a possibility of no longer being othered. To them, the experience of Jewish community, Jewish prayer, Jewish text, Hebrew, Yiddish, were elements and anchors of this otherness, and they couldn't wait to get away from it. And they thought that by getting away from it, that they would be doing a huge favor to their descendants, who for years had been ostracized or worse by very virtue of the difference which made them who they were, but also kept them from everyone else. So on my mother's side, my mother would go to Shabbat dinner at her grandparents' house every week, and her mother would light the Sabbath candle and say the prayer, but not explain to my mother what she was doing. My mother never understood why her grandmother stood silently before a candle before this delicious dinner every Friday night, nor could she understand why she wasn't allowed to have butter with her bread, because meat was served, and to have a dairy product with meat would have violated the tradition of keeping kosher, which her grandparents still did, but her parents couldn't wait to get away from it. That's on my mother's side. On my father's side, German Jews had already begun to assimilate, and he was of German stock, living in Bohemia, and my father's father, my great-grandfather's son, grew up with a Christmas tree, and we grew up with a Christmas tree, because to German Jews, this was a symbol of assimilative freedom. It wasn't a religious symbol, it was a cultural symbol, and it meant that they could be part of German culture. So all this is to say that they couldn't wait to get away from them, from traditional Jewish life, because it's what made them targets, what bore them down, and what made them vulnerable to the surrounding society, and was, for these reasons, but also for a host of other reasons, to them was starved of spiritual content.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, thank you for laying the nuances of that tension, and then we somewhat where we are today, right? Right. So that was a culture of excessive sameness, right? Oppressive through its sameness, definitely.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And one very positive thing about the United States is its pluralism, cultural, religious, right?
Yes.
That's the bright side of pluralism, so to speak, right? Because there might also be a darker side of pluralism, which is the mishmash of confusion, right? Or
we're seeing it now a little bit, right?
Yeah, and
right. in times of stress, pluralism can pull apart into sharply opposing camps that struggle for hegemony over that pluralism.
Mhm. Right. So in a way, this now as you described it, I realized how in a way privileged we are today, where you can be and I think it happened because the 60s, as you describe it, was still rather one-sided and also a little bit of a maybe oppressive secularism, or maybe not oppressive, but a secularism that expected you to perform or be in a certain way, where religion did not have its space, right? So you personally struggled to come back, let's say.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah. So because I'm the youngest of 6 children, I had older siblings who were deeply involved in the 60s world of protest and dissent, and who rejected whatever efforts our parents made to install any awareness of or participation in anything traditional. And my parents wanted their children to be citizens of the world. So to them, it was, I would say, not only not important for us to live a Jewish life or to marry Jewish people, but it was almost preferred that we not, because to do so would be to be sort of, in their view, I think, confining ourselves to a world that to them no longer existed. So my first wife, we had a very unsuccessful marriage. Fortunately, there were no children. My first wife was not Jewish, and of the 6 of my parents' children, I'm the only one married to a Jewish person, and the only one living a Jewish life. But that I think my parents not only were not disappointed by that, but they were glad that we could be citizens of the world. And when I married an observant Jewish woman and began living an observant Jewish life, they were a little alarmed. And I think they felt a little guilty, like, maybe we've done something wrong here. But they were also a little put off, I think, by the amount of observance that existed in our home, because that's what they'd been trained to run away from. And I think, Peter Berger is one sociologist who's very insightful about, the removal of the sacred canopy from over life. But I also am deeply appreciated of my other major mentor, Paul Mendesflor's insights into secularization and understanding, in some ways, secularization as a profoundly Jewish idea and a profoundly Jewish, in some ways, movement toward interpretive freedom. And again, I go back to the story of the binding of Isaac and Abraham's radically interpretive move to sacrifice the ram instead of his son as the seed germ of our interpretive freedom, which leads to a rainbow of interpretive opportunities, one of which is secularism. And the other hues of that rainbow are the multiculturalism that you have talked about, which is not only a social multiculturalism, but a spiritual one as well. And I think there are virtues and values in that. But in order to experience and inculcate those virtues, and in order to uphold those values, you need to understand what the roots are, where the roots are planted. And for years, I had no idea of that. I would say that even though I have a PhD, I'm only beginning to understand it. And I think it's very difficult nowadays for people who are in school, who are studying these things, to understand that, because they're already, in many instances, 1 generation or even 2 removed from it.
Yeah, and just there is also, and I remember a conversation I had in one of Professor Fishbane's classes with a student who was very anti-practice, right? This prejudice, we're still beholden to this quote unquote German idea that studying something is better than practicing something.
Yes.
Right. So there was which is very surprising that people still, especially in academia. And as you were speaking, Jonathan Haidt, I listened to a talk by him, and he mentioned he although I think he characterizes himself as atheist, he's part of a Jewish synagogue in New York. He's a Durkheimian, right? So it's the social the social thing.
Yeah.
But let me go back to your own life story, which is very rich and fascinating. I'm going to use another of Professor Fishbane's terms, the caesura, right? It seems to me, as I hear you speak, there were at least two, if not three caesuras, right? The moment where you go to Denver and you return within the Jewish fold, and then in the midst of your studies at the divinity school, there's another moment where you're getting, this detour that you're doing, and what are those moments? If you were, how did your understanding of Judaism change through those moments?
It's a really, really interesting question. I would say that my wife, although not a Reformed Jew by inclination, and although she didn't plan to have a career as a cantor, the person responsible for the musical portion of Jewish liturgy in a worship service, although she didn't plan to do that, she sort of fell into it because she was extremely Jewishly literate and she's a trained musician. So after she divorced, she and her first husband divorced, she was serving as a cantor at a Reformed synagogue in Denver. And she was a very early, she was one of the first, among the first female cantors. Even in the Reform movement, when she began working, it was unusual for women to be cantors. But she was living an observant Jewish life. And she was working on Friday nights and Saturday mornings at the synagogue. But before going to the synagogue for Friday night services, we would have Shabbat dinner. On Saturdays, we would go again. And the rhythm of our lives was a Jewish rhythm. Not a rhythm I'd really ever experienced for any appreciable amount of time. In fact, I remember I was working at a public relations firm in Denver at the time. And my colleagues, I remember a young woman who was a colleague of mine, and I was explaining to her that I didn't go out on Friday nights anymore because Friday night was the beginning of the Jewish Sabbath. She said, "You mean you can't go out on Friday nights anymore?" She was just absolutely appalled by that. And I remember teasing her and saying, "Sophie, I can't go out ever again on Friday night. It will never happen for the rest of my life. Isn't that horrible?" And to me, I was just playing with her. And to me, it was really freeing and liberating in a way to begin to live by a rhythm that was more than just, what do you want to do tonight? The intellectual growth so that was the experience of a practical life, a life of practice. That was the beginning of it, that we began to live by the calendar, which in any observant tradition you have to do, right?
And if I may interject at this point, what does that quote unquote do to you as a person, right? Because that's somewhat hard to understand for a postmodern person who's like, I can, like your friends, you can do whatever. You're the master of your destiny. Your choice is everything, right?
I think this is me being an armchair psychoanalyst, admittedly, but I think part of the reason that there is so much anxiety abroad in the world today is because there is no horizon. Everything can be freely chosen at any moment, and that is spiritually exhausting. To have unlimited free choice places the burden for meaning entirely, and experiential meaning, places the whole burden for creating meaning on the individual. That's a profoundly lonely and alienating experience. I was afraid. I was a little claustrophobic at first about becoming an observant Jew. And what I discovered is how liberating it was to have a structure to which you both submitted and against which you had to pull it through the act of interpretation. And I think, in both his theology and his examination of the Song of Songs, Michael Fishbane has brilliantly elucidated the 4 levels of Jewish interpretation. And to me, you can use that structure in every aspect of Jewish life. It's not even superimposed, it's elemental to Jewish life. That once you begin living the structure, you have a multivalent experience that is simply not possible if you're choosing everything you're doing and if your predilections are the center of the universe. It's going to be an exhausting, alienating, and anxiety-provoking experience. Tradition, ironically, is liberating. And it is the liberating aspect of tradition that I learned from these caesura that you're talking about. And I would say the two other caesura that are deeply meaningful to me in my own biography are the Experience of Zen Buddhism, which was a radical break from even thinking of myself as a Jew, and then having the full circle experience of realizing how Jewish I fundamentally am, and the experience of living in Mexico and being the other, in a society in which I had to learn how to be another kind of person, not only to speak another language, but to live as Mexican people live. I'll never forget, we arrived in the town of Cuernavaca where we were going to live on the night of November 1st, the Day of the Dead, which in Mexican culture is a huge holiday. You know, we do Halloween, we dress up and we give candy. It's a much more profoundly spiritual and hallucinatory experience, at least it was at that time in Mexico, where there were wild parties and parades and people dressed as skeletons and celebration of lost ancestors. And I was terrified. I was like, are we living in the jungle now? Where is this? It wasn't something I recognized as civilized until after being in Mexico for a while. And I realized there was a vibrant spiritual life at a level that I had never experienced. And that night was a vivid expression of it. So those are my four real experiences, really, you know, Denver, Zen Buddhism, Mexico, and then the last one being the intellectual experience of, yes, you've begun to experience the tradition, but here's all the history and the thought and the intellection that you still don't have about the experience. And for me, that was a deepening experience of a whole other kind, because I realized that the interpretive autonomy that Abraham experiences is still richly available to and incumbent upon all of us. We must read and interpret not only our sacred texts, but our experience. But if we try to do it without structure, it's bereft of all meaning. And we are called upon to create meaning anew every day from the ground up. It's exhausting, and it's lonely, and it's anxiety provoking. The structure of tradition gives meaning and structure to the creation of meaning itself. And that's what the University of Chicago experience opened for me.
Thank you. I want to explore more your this double identity. I probably know how you're the Zen Buddhist exploration and the Jewish exploration. You know that joke about the Irish guy who goes and becomes a Buddhist and comes back and he says, oh, okay, I'm not anymore doing this Protestant Catholic thing, and said, I'm Buddhist now. And they said, okay, what kind of Buddhist? Buddhist, Protestant Buddhist, or Catholic Buddhist? so we always so probably to you're Reformed or Orthodox.
Yeah, right. Are you Reformed, conservative, or Orthodox Buddhist?
But in many ways, it's hard to envisage a bigger contrast as a religious scholar too, right? Because Judaism, along with Islam, are probably the most legalistic or legally based religions out there, and Zen Buddhism is that part of Buddhism which emphasizes spontaneity and a certain type of anti-rationalism.
Correct.
Right. And so it's very interesting that for you, they sit in balance, or they balance each other.
Yes, part of the interesting and paradoxical philosophical challenge of Zen Buddhism is the idea that everything interpenetrates everything else, and that as a result, there's really no such thing as a self, that we live from moment to moment in deep intertwinement and conjunction with everything else, animate and inanimate, and that everything is arising and comprising and composing itself moment to moment. That
And
the idea of emptiness, which is often confused for nihilism, is actually the idea that nothing has its own inherent identity, that everything is coming together and interacting and coming to be through interaction, not simply through essence or action. So to get away from the idea of self helped me more deeply constitute and appreciate my own authentic sense of self. And it was in the experience of sustained meditation, which I deeply studied and practiced heavily for a period of about 4 years. Once I was really able to sink deeply into meditation, I had a visceral experience, more that I began to have it regularly, of a kind of encounter with my own Jewish neshama, my own Jewish essence. And that was when I decided I had to stop the practice of Buddhism and more deeply engage in Jewish study. And around this time, I was introduced to an ultra-Orthodox rabbi in England by the name of Akiva Tatz. And he had wanted to meet a Jew practicing Buddhism because he wanted to understand why so much of this was happening. It's a very well-documented phenomenon. And we had a correspondence that lasted a couple of years, which he and I turned into a book called Letters to a Buddhist Jew, which was published in 2004. And in it, he asked me, so what is alive for you in Buddhism that's not alive for you in Judaism? And for the first time in my life, I had to articulate all the ways that Judaism seemed to me to be dead or arthritic or moribund or impossible to live in the modern world. And he took me through why he thought this wasn't the case. And the book, in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish world, I think has come to be seen, unfortunately in my view, as the definitive triumph of Orthodox Judaism over idol worship. But many people have told me, many Jewish people have told me that the book had reopened them to Judaism because of the questions that I asked the rabbi and because of the answers that he gave. He came along for me at a really important point where I was no longer judgmental about observant Judaism, but I was aware of a certain strata of Judaism that I had not experienced. And I was asking him, so where is this? Where is this kind of experience of no self? Where is this experience of the spontaneous arising of everything moment to moment? Where is the feeling of intimate encounter and interaction with everything and everybody else? And he said, it's here, and it's here, and it's here. He just showed me where it was. So that was a sort of radical gift from the cosmos, to be able to enter into deep conversation with an intensely Orthodox rabbi. And I said to him, this goes back to something you and I talked about for a little bit earlier, the sameness that appears externally in Orthodoxy, right? Everybody has to be the same, behave the same, look the same, dress the same, observe the same holidays in the same way. He was like, when you're on the inside, the radical, and all the guys are wearing black hats and white shirts and dark suits, it's only then that you see the radical individuality of people, because their essence jumps out at you. You really get away from the external trappings of what earrings, what piercings, what fashions, what purses are the person identifying them by. You have to go inside, and the inside leaps out. That had never occurred to me. Didn't know it was possible.
So thank you. Yeah, I'll have to look up that book. Yeah, I wasn't aware of it. Thank you.
But it's interesting. I got teased about that book at the University of Chicago, which I thought was a really sad experience. Fellow students would say, "Oh my God, you think you can have an intellectual life, and you wrote a book called Letters to a Buddhist Jew?" I got teased about that book, which made me really sad, because I thought, to ridicule, first of all, to ridicule a book you haven't read is profoundly anti-intellectual. Second of all, to misapprehend the dialogue between two radically different types of people as sort of a nursery rhyme or a fable is horribly simplistic. So I just wanted to throw that in. I'm sorry.
Well, and did you get that from people or students who were familiar with Buber, or because this would be a radical Buberian thing you did, right? This
They were all familiar with Buber. They were not necessarily Buberians, but they had read their Buber. You wouldn't know it, but they had.
well,
They took it as an I-it experience and missed the I-thou of the encounter that's in this book. That's my view.
yeah, yeah. And so then you said you after practicing intense Zen meditation, now you're more, in terms of your spiritual practice, practicing praying Jewish prayer, and have incorporated elements of Zen Buddhism meditation technique in terms of vipassana, the mindfulness part.
So when I began to move away from Buddhist practice, I looked for teachers of Jewish meditation, which combines aspects and attitudes of prayer with aspects and attitudes of objectless or mindful meditation. And this was something that arose in the Jewish community just as I began to look for it. I think a lot of Jewish people like me who had moved into Eastern traditions came out of them and wanted to know if it was possible to frame that experience in a Jewish context. And the answer has been yes, definitively yes. And over the last 2 or 3 decades, a vibrant and rich and multifaceted tradition of Jewish mindfulness practice and teaching has arisen. I've taught aspects of this practice for Orot, the Center for Jewish Mindfulness here in the Chicago area. And I've taught at Jewish synagogues and other places the ability to frame mindfulness practice in a Jewish context. So it does take on aspects of vipassana, but it is much more and much less than a Jewish practice, a Buddhist practice pretending to be a Jewish practice. I want to be clear that that's not what it is. The practice has its roots in ancient practices, rabbinic practices of preparation for prayer, and the coming down from the electrifying experience of prayer itself. So the Talmudic sages would prepare with a kind of meditation before prayer and would do the same after, and they would do that 3 times a day. So unearthing some of the practices that those sages developed and engaged in has been resurfaced in contemporary Jewish practice. That's part of how I have merged those 2 experiences.
And probably techniques in Hasidism too, and
absolutely,
right.
Yeah.
And along the, there's also prejudice against prayer in the West, right? I mean, the way we have become so enamored of meditation, which like even the Buddhists call it mech meditation, right? It's like they laugh, okay, mech meditation as the panacea to everything. Okay, you're depressed, meditate. It's a little bit too much, right?
Right.
And in a way, we're not aware, and in Christianity as well, of prayer. We have this misunderstanding of prayer as this crazy thing, mindless people are doing because they're praying to a sugar daddy up there who's giving them stuff, or a credit card that company who's forgiving their sins. So it's fascinating that you and in a way it's always good to get out of your tradition in order to know your tradition. I know Professor Fishbane has done that, or mentors, this notion of knowing your tradition from outside, stepping out.
Yes. Michael Fishbane has done that, brilliantly. And Paul Mendesflor too is in constant dialogue with people from other traditions. And I deeply admire the way that he does that, but does it from a position of, from a deeply Jewish context. I would say that
he's an embodiment of Buberian dialogue.
He absolutely is. He's a Buberian tzaddik. He really is. The experience of being radically jolted outside of my traditional zones of comfort, both in all of a sudden living in Mexico as a 12-year-old and all of a sudden living an observant Jewish life, and also all of a sudden being a student around people half my age, all of these things helped deepen the experience of prayer. But so did a lot of the work that I read, not only the work of Michael Fishbane on prayer, but for example, the comparison of a Durkheimian social functionism and a Freudian psychological functionism. In other words, prayer is both a psychological experience, but it is also a deeply social experience. And in Jewish tradition, you have to have a certain number of people together in order for certain kinds of prayer to even take place. And that is not because we need this much electrical current so that the guy in the sky can hear us. It's not that. It's that the power of collective presence deepens the experience of saying words in certain orders that have been said for thousands of years. It connects one through multiple levels of experience and planes of time, and so deepens experience. This is why Jewish atheists will engage in prayer, even though they don't believe it has any particular efficacy in terms of wanting wishes to come true. It has meaning. It still has meaning. And I think this is something that's hard for the modern sensibility to grasp, because prayer, understandably, has resonances with we all must do certain things at certain times, and we must do them certain ways. And if we don't do those things, we are bad people. That is the modern perception of any kind of authority. And the result is the absolute undermining of any kind of authority and the meaning that authority brings with it.
Wow. And before we close, because I know we've been, this has been an incredibly rich conversation. I noticed that you said your maternal grandmother had gone to Hull House.
Yes.
And as an immigrant myself, and I have a deep respect and appreciation of Hull House, and I've never heard anyone who knew anyone who had gone there.
My grandmother's life.
Adams picture here.
Do you really?
Yeah, along with Albert Schweitzer, Paul Mendes Floor.
I love that. I love that.
The saints.
My grandmother's life was totally transformed by Hull House, because it was there that she was treated like a person with hopes and aspirations, with native intelligence and talents, and not as a child that needed to be fed and put to work in the grocery store or pushed out of the way. It was for a very poor child of immigrants, a radically opening experience to her worth as a human being. Changed her life.
Thank you. And before we close, I do it always and ask a few closing words of advice, maybe koans for riddles or words of advice for the young people, so to speak.
So I go back to this story that I heard when I was practicing Buddhism, and I heard lots of stories, from my Jewish friends about how Buddhism was idol worship. And I thought, there are aspects of Judaism that, if we're not careful, can become idol worship. And I heard a story from a Zen practitioner who was originally Jewish. At one time, it was estimated that as many as 1/3 of American-born Buddhists were born Jewish. So there are a lot of Jewish Buddhist practitioners and teachers in this country. And I heard this story from one of them, that a rabbi is confronting a Buddhist about how Buddhist practice is nothing but idol worship. And they're standing by the altar in a Zen center where the rabbi has come to confront the Buddhist about how he's luring Jews into idol worship. And they're standing by the altar, and there's a statue of the Buddha on the altar. And the rabbi says, you're bowing to this statue. It's explicitly prohibited by God. It's idol worship. It's investing power in a thing that has to be reserved only for the power that resides in the creator of the universe. It's the ultimate sin. And the Buddhist goes, okay. And he picks up the head of the Buddha and smashes it on the ground. And he says to the rabbi, now let me see you do that to your Torah. Of course, if a Torah touches the ground, if a Torah is dropped or mishandled in any way, it is a horrible occasion that needs to be remedied in a number of ways by fasting and if necessary, repair of the Torah itself, which doesn't make it idol worship, but makes it a really interesting look at what constitutes idol worship and what doesn't. So I tell this story because I think it's important for us as moderns to realize that what many of the things that we think are most important are actually idols. And what are idols exactly? Idols are nothing more than things invested with power that they don't actually possess. Things to which we accord importance, essence, maybe even life, that don't actually have those qualities. Things like exterior appurtenances, things like apps and various kinds of media to which we devote the majority of our attention, are invested with power that they don't typically have. And if we do that, we sap our experience of meaning. We're in danger of living in a horizonless world, and we become profoundly alone. And one of the remedies for that is to find some way to deeply study and exist in community that has more ancient roots than whatever happened at the Academy Awards 6 weeks ago. That's my koan for the day.